Hello, everyone. The United States gets more oil from Canada than from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and all of OPEC combined. Let that land for a second. The country Washington has spent the last year trying to bully into submission is also the country quietly keeping American gas prices from exploding. And Mark Carney just figured out exactly how to use that. If you've been watching the situation develop and feeling like something doesn't add up, you're right. Something doesn't add up because the story you've been told, the one where America holds all the cards and Canada just has to take whatever it's given, has a massive hole in it. Today we're going to walk straight through that hole together. If this kind of deep geopolitical analysis is what you're after, hit subscribe right now. We do this every week, and you don't want to be catching up after the fact. Let's start with the thing nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. The United States is addicted to Canadian energy. Not dependent, addicted. There is a difference. Dependence implies you could switch if you had to. Addiction means you can't function without it. The U.S. imports roughly 5.5 million barrels of Canadian crude every single day. That is not a trade relationship. That is a lifeline. And every time Trump posts something aggressive about Canada somewhere in the background, an American refinery is processing Canadian oil to keep Midwestern gas prices from going vertical. Now, here's what makes this moment genuinely different from every previous moment in the U.S.-Canada relationship. It's not just that Canada has leverage. Countries have leverage all the time and never use it. What's different right now is that, for the first time in decades, Canada has a prime minister who is actually willing to pick up that leverage and do something with it. Mark Carney is not a politician in the traditional sense. He ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England during Brexit. This is a man who has sat across the table from the most powerful economic forces in the world under conditions of maximum pressure and made decisions that shaped entire national economies. He does not panic. He does not posture. He calculates. And right now, he's making one of the most consequential calculated moves in modern Canadian history. Here's what he did and why it matters more than most people realize. Canada quietly began accelerating conversations with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Not just trade conversations, but strategic partnership conversations, the kind that take months to set up and signal serious intent. At the same time, Carney's government began reviewing the terms under which Canadian oil, minerals, and electricity flow south across the border. Nothing was cut off. Nothing was threatened publicly. But the message to Washington was unmistakable. The tap can be adjusted, and here's where everything changes. Within weeks of those signals, the tone coming out of Washington shifted. Not softer, actually louder. Trump's statements about Canada became more frequent, more personal, more emotionally charged. J.D. Vance started going on television to talk about Canada taking advantage of America. Pete Buttigieg waded in. Suddenly, everyone in the administration had something to say about Canada. That pattern, that specific pattern of escalating rhetoric, is one of the clearest signals in all of geopolitics that something has gone wrong for the side doing the shouting. Think about it this way. When you are negotiating from genuine strength, you don't raise your voice. You don't need to. You state your terms and you wait. The fact that Washington has moved from quiet pressure to loud public attacks tells you everything you need to know about where the internal conversations are actually going. The louder the statement, the more uncomfortable the reality behind it. Trade negotiators who have spent their careers in these rooms will tell you the same thing every time. When the other side gets emotional, you are winning. Emotion is what happens when the expected outcome is no longer guaranteed. And right now, Washington expected Canada to be on its knees by this point in the process. Instead, Canada is standing up, expanding its options, and forcing the United States to recalculate. Let's talk about the specific levers because this is where the story gets genuinely alarming for the American side. The first lever is the one we already touched on, energy, but it goes deeper than just crude oil. Canada is also the largest foreign supplier of electricity to the United States. There are American cities, particularly in the Northeast, that are directly wired into the Canadian grid. New York, Vermont, Maine. The relationship is so integrated that during certain peak demand periods, Canadian hydropower is what keeps American lights on. This is not a theoretical vulnerability for the United States. It is a physical, literal, switch-flippable vulnerability. The second lever is critical minerals. And this one might actually be bigger than energy in the long run. The modern economy runs on lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and rare earth elements. These are the materials inside every electric vehicle, every smartphone, every advanced weapon system, and every piece of military hardware the Pentagon produces. Canada has enormous reserves of almost all of them. The United States, for all its military and economic power, does not. Washington has been trying for years to build a domestic critical mineral supply chain and has largely failed. The supply lines run north, and Mark Carney knows it. The third lever is financial, and this one rarely gets discussed, though it absolutely should. Canadian pension funds and institutional investors hold over $3 trillion in assets globally, with a massive concentration in American infrastructure, real estate, and financial markets. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan alone is one of the largest infrastructure investors on the planet. Canadian capital is quietly woven into the financial fabric of the American economy in ways most Americans have no idea about. Pull even a fraction of that back, redirect it toward European or Asian markets, and you create pressure that no tariff can counteract. But here's the part nobody's talking about. And this is the move that could redefine the entire relationship. Carney's government is not just building leverage. It is building infrastructure. For a world where Canada no longer needs American approval to thrive, the shift toward Europe is not just about replacing American markets. It is about permanently reducing Canada's vulnerability to American political cycles. Because the fundamental problem for Canada has never been that the United States is powerful. The fundamental problem is that Canada's entire economic architecture was built around the assumption of American good faith. And that assumption has now been broken. When a country like the United States casually threatens to annex its closest ally, jokes about making it the 51st state, and uses tariffs as a pressure weapon while claiming it doesn't need that ally anyway, something irreversible happens in the relationship. Trust evaporates. And without trust, trade relationships restructure themselves. Not overnight, but permanently. Carney understands this, which is why the most important thing he is doing is not negotiating with Trump. It is building the economic and diplomatic architecture that makes future negotiations less necessary. Every new trade corridor with Europe is a permanent reduction in Canadian vulnerability. Every new critical minerals agreement with Japan or South Korea is a permanent diversification away from American dependence. These moves don't make headlines the way a Carney-Trump meeting would, but they matter infinitely more. And now we arrive at the moment that crystallized everything. Canada canceled a $1.44 billion defense procurement contract that would have sent that money directly to American defense companies. Publicly, Ottawa framed it as a routine contract review, but the timing was impossible to miss. The cancellation landed in the middle of the most intense period of U.S.-Canada tension in living memory, and it was aimed directly at one of Washington's most sensitive pressure points. The American defense industrial base is deeply dependent on ally procurement. Canadian defense spending flows to American companies, American workers, and American congressional districts. When Carney's government pulled that contract, it sent a message that landed in exactly the places where political pain is most acutely felt. The reaction from Washington was once again completely disproportionate to the stated significance of the decision, which tells you everything. A $1.5 billion contract in a multi-trillion-dollar defense economy should barely register. The fact that it triggered visible frustration is a tell. Canada touched something real. Applied pressure to a point that actually mattered, and Washington's reaction confirmed it. This is the part of the Canada-US story that the mainstream narrative completely misses. It keeps framing this as a story about a small country trying to survive the wrath of a superpower. That framing is wrong. What is actually happening is a sophisticated strategic actor using precisely targeted economic pressure at exactly the moments designed to maximize discomfort on the other side. That is not survival mode. That is grand strategy. Now, let's be honest about the risks, because they are real, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. Canada still sends roughly 75% of its exports to the United States. Diversification takes years. Infrastructure takes years. Trade corridors take years. And in the meantime, Canadian businesses, workers, and families are absorbing real pain from tariffs and trade uncertainty. The leverage Carney is building is real, but it is future leverage. The pain Canada is experiencing right now is present pain. That gap between now and the future is where the political risk lives. If Carney cannot hold his coalition together through that gap, if Canadian voters decide the pain is too much before the leverage fully materializes, then the strategy collapses. This is why the domestic politics matter just as much as the geopolitics. Carney has to sell this strategy to a country that is anxious, uncertain, and watching prices rise. He has to say, in effect, trust me, the short-term pain is worth the long-term position. And that is always a hard sell. But here is what gives him a real shot at pulling it off. The Canadian public has, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely unified around a sense of national identity that is not defined by proximity to the United States. The hostility from Washington did something unexpected. It woke up a form of Canadian nationalism that usually lies dormant. People who had never thought twice about buying American products started making deliberate choices to buy Canadian. Politicians who had spent their careers carefully managing their relationship with Washington started saying out loud what they had previously only said in private. The political conditions have changed, and Carney is reading those conditions correctly. What you're watching right now is not a trade dispute. It is a realignment, a fundamental restructuring of how Canada understands its place in the world and what it is willing to accept from its most powerful neighbor. And the person driving that realignment is doing it with the calm, methodical precision of someone who has managed financial crisis for a living. The United States has never faced a Canadian government quite like this one, and Washington does not yet fully understand what it is dealing with. Here is a line that should stay with you. The most dangerous opponent is not the one who fights back loudly. It's the one who quietly makes it cost you more than you were prepared to.